Awesome. Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Jeanette Jackson, CEO of Foresight. We are very excited with the topic of our discussion today, webinar number 8 for our COVID-19 Clean Tech series. A few housekeeping items. If you do have questions, please enter them in the chat function. If you are moving around and listening at the same time, which a lot of us have been doing lately, please try to mute yourself. We've heard some funny stories in the background on some of the webinars over the last couple of weeks. And of course, this will be recorded and you will have access to the recording afterwards. Those are my welcome notes. We do have a few quick program updates that we will share with you. And then we're going to dive into the real reason why we're all here with special guest, Mr. Jeremy Rifkin, and colleagues Kerry Sherman and Charles Holmes. I will be passing over the hosting duties to Charles shortly here. And then, of course, as always, we do try to have an open Q&A session and some closing remarks. So really briefly, there are some program announcements from Foresight. These are actually more Foresight specific announcements. In the past couple of weeks, we've really tried to share as much information as we can from our federal and provincial partners on all of the different programs available to clean tech companies across Canada. We've also seen a really broad group of stakeholders on all of these webinars from government partners, industry, investment community, and of course, clean tech SMEs that are driving the innovation across Canada. So I'll just highlight these 4 new programs and then we will jump into it. The first one is that we will be offering a new Clean Tech SME COVID-19 support program that will be launching on May 19th. This is a Pan-Canada support program that will give one-on-one, basically executive and resident support to clean tech SMEs. We will also be having group training sessions as well as some specifics on grant writing, fundraising, and other elements that we think can help us navigate through COVID-19 and prepare for a robust restart as things start to get moving in the weeks ahead. We are also launching a new water technology cluster program. We've been traditionally working with Blue Tech Research. We'll also have Water Smart and a few other folks coming in to support the water sector across Canada. That will start with access to the Blue Tech Virtual Forum on June 4th. And then of course, there will be some additional business, market, and technical support. And that will be launching on May 19th as well. If you have not already applied, if you are in Calgary or have contacts in Calgary, we are running our 3rd cohort of the program in partnership with Platform Calgary. This, of course, is access to our launch and deliver programming. Please, go online and fill out that application. And then we always have an open call. It's been a really exciting couple of weeks at Foresight. We've welcomed over 10 or 12 new companies in just the last 2 weeks. And so that remains open on the website. There are going to be, of course, ongoing announcements from the provincial and federal level, and we'll continue to share that information weekly on these webinars. But without further ado, I am really delighted to have an amazing topic of discussion. It's the Green New Deal plus because Mr. Rifkin has written so many amazing books and is a thought leader on so many different items. So I'm going to unmute our special guests who will be joining Mr. Rifkin, Kerry Sherman and Charles Holmes. I'm also going to pass the hosting duties over to Charles. And Charles, before I'll pass it over and then Charles can jump in. One of the reasons this came out is what we've seen with COVID-19 is an unprecedented ability to collaborate and connect and bring people together to change habits, change how we move, how we play, how we work. And with that becomes an opportunity to think perhaps more broadly on how that type of mentality and activity can impact what we do on a clean tech perspective. And so Mr. Rifkin, as author of the Green New Deal, has lots to share on that. And Charles, I'll pass it over to you.
Jeanette, thank you so much. Am I unmuted? Yes, I think I am. Thank you to you and your team at Foresight for having the foresight to host this. Jeanette, maybe you can just stop sharing screens so we can see a little bit more of each other. That would be great. I'm sure, like many of you, are getting used to this this environment, this Zoom environment. So I'm not going to go through sort of the housekeeping. Jeanette's highlighted that. I want to say thank you again to Jeanette for the invitation to host and MC this together with herself and with Kerry. I see many familiar faces. For those of you I don't know, I'm based in North Vancouver. I've been working in a variety of contexts as a facilitator and convener. I don't need to say much about myself because this is really about Jeremy. And I do want to acknowledge and thank Kerry Sherman for her passion and interest in Jeremy's work. Kerry is the owner and founder of Shambar Restaurant and also the co-founder of Innovation Capital, and put out the invitation to Jeremy to join us. And I thought we'd just kick off, Kerry. You've been passionate about Jeremy's work for a long time, and have been a real champion for it here. And be curious to hear from you, what is it about his message and approach to creating a future distinct from the past that's compelling to you? I'll put that question to you. And Jeremy, I have a question for you as well that links a little bit more to one of your previous books. I know we're going to focus on the Green New Deal, but the work you did on the empathic civilization strikes me as being incredibly important at this time. And I'll pose a question to you. We'll hear a little bit of a response, and then we're going to have a conversation with each other in smaller groups in response to a question. And then we'll come back and go deep into the exploration around how the Green New Deal is relevant in the context of British Columbia and more broadly, Canada. So Kerry, what is it about Jeremy's work that's been struck you and been so compelling?
My introduction to Jeremy's work came actually through, I, at the time, was on the board of the Vancouver Economic Commission, and saw a great frustration, mostly from entrepreneurs and especially in the clean tech sector, of trying to push through policies and trying to get alignment within multiple levels of government. And really asking the question, it's so obvious that we need to make this transition to a post-carbon economy. And what's the plan? Like, who has a plan? Who's doing this? And, you know, unfortunately finding out there really wasn't a plan at any level of government that was enabling the change that we needed to occur. And through an introduction and hearing Jeremy speak, what compelled me to really reach out and try and mobilize having his work here was that Jeremy's been doing these 10-month facilitated processes, which aligns all levels of government and brings together regions to be able to make this change. And what that 10-month process does is brings together all the sectors of a region, and then also the horizontals of education and all the other parts within our region that creates a sustainable hub, and whether it's sustainable agriculture and food systems. But the alignment of all of this was really around the Green New Deal, and that those are the values that as humans we actually all want to see. And so how do we have a future that actually gives us what we all want as human beings? And it was, I think, the ability for this process that was nonpartisan to really engage people at a community level, to come together to work for something much bigger. And in doing that, it was really engaging people to step outside of their perspectives and their opinions and get out of silos and be able to work together for systemic change.
Thanks, Kerry. So, Jeremy, kind of on that note, the potential of working together for this kind of change, I was struck by an interview I watched with you where you talked about the kind of the enlightenment mindset of us being largely driven by materialistic, predatory, competitive, autonomous mindsets. And you talk about, well, if that's the case, if that's what we're driven by, we may be doomed. But there is something else, something much higher and greater in us to appeal to. And I guess the question I'd like to pose to you to start with is, what is giving you the greatest hope that the human race can come together in a way that you speak to as being necessary in the context of much of your writing and speaking? What's giving you greatest hope right now?
Well, first of all, it's nice to be here with all of you. Thanks for taking some time. You know, I'm just giving my personal experience as an activist over the years. And that is when we've been dealing with really crises, especially in the EU, where I've spent the last 25 years, we've noticed that when there's a time of real crisis, and we've had pandemics, we've had before this, as you know, as you have in Canada, and we've also had a lot of climate disasters in the European Union. And what we noticed over a period of time is that when one of these disasters hits, whether it's a pandemic or a climate disaster, no government can handle this on their own, nor can individual companies in the business community. And during these crises, what we see is everybody comes out and they help each other. Community groups, neighborhood associations, religious organizations. And this is where you see the real empathic impulse that's just embedded into our neurobiology. It's who we are. When you see a baby coming into life, their first instinct isn't predatory, utilitarian, selfish, libido-driven. That's just, that may be the Anglo-American Enlightenment, but that's not the way any parent understands their child. We're actually born with empathy in our neural circuitry. You really see it during crises. Everybody comes out, risks their lives for themselves, their animals, and each other. And so what we began to realize in the EU is that we were taking the wrong approach in trying to transform the society into a zero emission, a sustainable economic and social system, because traditionally governments will come to the floor and ministers will have their plans, and then businesses will be seated contracts, and we end up with all of these pilot projects that don't engage the community, and they don't move us to a transformation of the infrastructure of the society. So we came to the understanding that we're in a changing framework with pandemics and climate change, and it's going to require a new form of governance, which we call peer assembly governance. That we're going to have to lateralize government, because these climate events are happening so frequently that you learn from the first one, and you have ad hoc organizations coming together, and then they learn from the first one, and the second one hits, even before they can restore their communities from the first one. So we're beginning to see an informal, if you will, coming together, a new form of lateral governance, where communities are engaged all the time with their governments. And we certainly see this with the pandemics, we certainly see it with climate change. And we began to realize that that's the way to scale up these transformational projects. We have 9,000 cities that have signed up for the Paris climate agreements. And if you went and talked to any of those mayors, they'll show you their 5 electric buses, their 10 LEED buildings, their nice new bike paths. They're all little pilots. And what we need now is a complete transformation of the infrastructure of every region of the world. In the EU, we realize that's going to happen locally. Nation states can create codes, regulations, and standards, but all their 325 regions are going to deploy, which is going to be the case in Canada and the case in the United States. So given that, we started on a path that we weren't sure would work, frankly. And we had some difficult beginnings, but I'll give you just a quick anecdote. The president of Hauts-de-France, that's the largest industrial region of France. It's 10% of the population. It's the Rust Belt, but it's also the main steel, auto, rail, industrial region. So 6 years ago, the president came to us and said, well, can you bring experts, quote unquote, to come in here and do a plan for us? I said, absolutely not. Won't do it. And he was surprised. I said, if we do, it'll sit on the shelf in some minister's office and you'll do another pilot. And I said, I'm too old for this, and we don't want to do this because time's running out. But what I said to him is, you go back to your region and get every mayor across every political party engaged, every university, every civic society organization, all the chambers of commerce, and bring them all together, and then maybe we'll have a conversation. I didn't think he would do it, because many political leaders walk. They don't do it. Well, he was pretty tenacious, and he came back several months later and said, we've done it. And I said, we still can't do it. We're not a consulting organization. But if you're willing to set up a peer assemblage where the government leads and you bring in thousands of people, not a stakeholder group or a focus group, we want thousands of people coming in, and then you assemble a peer assembly group, like a grand jury of 300 people with thousands of others connecting in. And then you create your goals and deliverables based on a third industrial revolution transformation to a zero emission economy. You have to have the architecture. And then we will bring to you whatever expertise you need, but you're going to build out the roadmap. And then you're going to maintain these peer assemblies forever, so that everyone in the community can have a year where they volunteer across generations to be responsible for the larger community and for the shift to a sustainable society during their lifetime, sort of like an extended jury. And the fact is, at first, people are kind of suspicious. They don't think it'll work. Some people just want to game the system. But in each of these regions we've done, France, Netherlands, Luxembourg, what's happened is they come together and they look out for the community spirit, and they realize they're there for their children and for their grandchildren. And they're able to create these unbelievably complex and sophisticated, but easily understand roadmaps, and then they start deploying on scale across their entire region. So last thought, Haute France, for example, is in its 6th year. We're still there helping, but they designed the roadmaps. And they've got 1,200 projects. Thousands of people have been involved, thousands of new jobs, tech parks, and they're moving to scale with huge infrastructure projects. And they did it on their own. And it shows to me that the empathic spirit, especially in this time of crisis, when you give an opportunity for a whole region to engage, not just one time off, but across their lifetime, it actually can work. And it's pretty heartening, actually.
Jeremy, you're saying that people are coming and staying together. And in part, there's a structure and a framework that's helping that. And you laid out high level what that is. What is your sense, if you were to point to a couple of things that you have sensed and felt as keeping people there, committed to that? What would you say are the top couple things?
I think the first thing is, in the first year, the 10 months where we engage with them and they're engaging with each other, they're learning to cross the disciplines, to cross their areas of interest. It's very unusual for a business, let's say an entrepreneur, to be in total engagement with a civil society organization dealing with social infrastructure, to be dealing with the university as dealing with academics, to be dealing with a trade union that's dealing with employment. But by these processes, they began to create an esprit de corps, and they cross the boundaries, and there's no more boundaries. They start to work as a community. And then after that 10 months, new people come in and rotate year after year. So everyone gets an opportunity, and what happens is feedback. So let's say you're a high school student on the pier, or a millennial. They come back and share this with their families. They all live in the region. So eventually they begin to see that they're responsible for their bioregion. They're responsible for their 19 kilometers of biosphere. They're responsible for their infrastructure shift and the new business models. And that's really a very different than traditional democracy, where you vote for someone for office and then they look out for all the interests and they try to figure out how to manage the various interests. These aren't interests. These are communities engaged in trying to find a way to live sustainably and pass it on to their children. It is a different political model, for sure.
It strikes me that you're talking about collaboration at a level that we recognize we long for when we experience it, but may have never imagined or believed it was possible.
Yeah, there's a lot of skepticism at first. And let me tell you some funny things. There's also people that try to game the system. We've had occasions where someone will, try to become chairperson of one of the committees, and they just want their little project or their business or, their graduate program involved. But overall, 90% of the people that engage in this, first, they don't realize that they're going to have to do the work. Then it becomes clear they are, and we're there to help them. Then it becomes clear that they're going to have to do their own roadmaps. And when this happens, they start to feel a sense of, it's not just community spirit, and they feel a sense of agency. They really feel, my God, we're now responsible for our communities. This is new. This is not a focus group or stakeholder group, and they pass it on. So, for example, the 26 universities there, they've come together in a cohort, working together to help each other. We have this also in social housing. So it does work, but I'm going to say something that's important. You do need some strong government leadership to enable these committees to work together. For our part, we realize that the key thing is for people to think systemically. So if you look at these roadmaps that they do, they're way more sophisticated than anything you get from consulting organizations, many of whom I work with. They're up to 500 pages. They're completely interdisciplinary, where everyone is learning how what they're doing needs to connect in with someone else. The social infrastructure, the political infrastructure, the business infrastructure. And then they realize that they can't just stop with one project. This goes on for years and it's a new form of governance. We are informalizing a new form of governance. And we're seeing this now in these 3 regions. And it's for me, I'm 75 years old, and I got to say it's heartening for me. This is the one thing that keeps me going. I really do believe that it's in our neural circuitry, especially now, where people can either be frightened and isolated or come together as a shared community. And I think if people have the option, they would prefer coming together as a shared community in a more empathic way. It's not something up here in the sky. It's what we feel we need in order to share our humanity, really at this really difficult time in human history.
So, Jeremy, it's just an absolutely beautiful segue into something we're going to experiment with. Foresight, I don't think, has done this on sessions like this before, and I'm sure there's some people who have come thinking that they're going to listen for an hour. But in keeping with the message that you're sharing with us, it's our capacity and ability to come together across difference with strangers, to listen deeply into what is the possibility that's compelling for each of us so that we can co-create that together. So in keeping with that, we're going to have 50 breakout rooms for 5 minutes, and again, I'm sure some of you who are here are groaning. You're immediately turning off your videos, maybe even muting yourself. This is an invitation, and as with any invitation, you are free to say no. You're free to pass. I love the saying, you know, if you can't say no to an invitation, your yes means nothing. So you're automatically going to go into groups. It's only going to be for 5 minutes. And the question would like to pose is, you're all paying a price to be here. You've given an hour of your time to join. Why did you say yes? Why did you say yes to coming to this conversation? And you're going to have to accept the request that will come on your screen to join a breakout room, and it will be 5 minutes. 5 minutes in total. There will be 3 to 4 people in each room. So please manage your time. Be aware of how much airtime you take. We'll be back in 5 minutes. So welcome back, Elizabeth and others. I'm sorry there was no one in your breakout room. Would love to just hear 1 or 2 comments. If you can raise your hand. I should be able to see if you raise your hand. There's a little button at the bottom. If you want to just comment on something that struck you in your breakout with the others you were speaking with, just across the bottom, there's a hand raise function. So Angel Valentini, I'm not sure if I've got your name right, but go for it.
Hi there. It's Ange Valentini. You were really close. We had a tiny chat. Richard Miller and I connected, and we learned that his mom is here on Gabriel Island, which is where I'm hanging out these days, and that we're both really interested in the different ways different communities are tackling a green agenda and sustainability and the opportunities for supporting innovation in that work.
Awesome. Thanks, Ange. And really appreciate the comments in the chat as well. It worked fine for us, had a great conversation, it was great for us. I met 2 good people, seasoned at this. We were still in the middle and you cut us off. It was a great 5 minutes. I was the only one there. Again, apologies. Serendipitous discovery of synergies with Paul and the people who were in his room. It was actually one of our hopes, was that there would be some connections that would create synergies. Times of crisis shows us how resilient people are, collaborating across lots of different levels, the need for speed to react. I'm going to just turn back to Jeremy for his comments on things that have been showing up in the chat. But is there anyone else who wants to raise their hand to make a comment about the 5 minutes you just had before we go back to Jeremy? All right. So Jeremy, I know one question that came up as people went to the breakouts was around communism. And you said, yeah, I'll speak to that when we come back.
Well, let me preface it. I'm a graduate of the Wharton School of Business, and I taught the Advanced Management Program, which is our CEO program. We bring in CEOs for 5 weeks from around the world. I did it for 15 years. And so I've done a lot of work with business, but I've also been really privileged in my life to be an activist in communities. I don't think there needs to be a separation between the business community and the civil society and governance. What we found in Europe, these regions, the last three, we've done 9 regions, but the last 3 are very big industrial regions. It's France, it's the 23 cities of Rotterdam to The Hague, which is the petrochemical complex, and it's Luxembourg, one of the 2 financial capitals. I think that we do a disservice if we don't put community above ideology. We need to put community above ideology. And what happens that's exciting in these peer groups, which last forever, hopefully, is they began to cross their own boundaries, and they began to experience the other, and they began to learn. And it's not only enlightening, it's a good experience for them, because they began to realize that what talents they have to bear can be enriched by their engagement with people they normally would never interact with on any level. So this is the kind of governance we need. So I'm not a skeptic in this regard. I'm also not naive. This works. We know it can work. We now have examples of scaled regions that are doing this. And I don't think it's unique to Europe. We did it in San Antonio, Texas, which is the 7th largest city in the United States. And they moved from nuclear power to wind, and are the largest wind producing power in the United States and 5th in the world. And they did it because the whole community was engaged. And this does work. But you have to have the architecture. Let me just say, you can't just come in with a bunch of projects. There is an architecture to every great economic revolution in history, and they're about infrastructure transformations. Every major economic transformation, social transformation in history, there's been 7 or 8 big ones, have brought together 3 technologies to create a completely new frame of reference for living. New communications, to bring more people together to manage their day-to-day life, new sources of energy to power their day-to-day lives, new sources of mobility to move their day-to-day lives. So when communication revolutions, new energy regimes, new mobility comes together, changes governance, changes business models. So today that's what's happening, but piecemeal. So everyone's on the internet, that's a communication revolution. Now in Europe and in California, New York, some of the places in Canada, that communication revolution is converging with another internet, an energy internet, an electricity internet, a solar and wind, where millions of people can share their electricity. Now the 2 internets are converging with a third one, autonomous mobility and logistics internet of electric and fuel cell transport. And all of those internets together right on top of a retrofitted building stock, which is the Internet of Things. So you have to have the architecture of the transformation and then customize it to the social needs, the economic needs, the community needs of your region, and then cross-border. This is the way it's working in Europe, and I think this is the way, hopefully, it'll work everywhere in the world. It's more globalization, not globalization.
So, Jeremy, a couple things in response. I just want to say for folks who are joining us who are not familiar with your work, in the invitation, Foresight did a lovely job of putting out a video. I think it's about an hour and a half where you talk about these 3, the communications, energy, and mobility. And folks, I really encourage you to watch that. To learn more about, you're just getting a snippet, obviously, in this conversation. But Jeremy, this question that Peter's posed, and I'll try and get to as many of these as I can as we go through this. How do these peer assemblage governance structures function with existing government? And his question also has to do with access to tax and other levers.
You need to have strong leadership at the government level, and the regional government level. In this case, it would be you'd have to have strong leadership with your mayors, your metropolitan regions, and hopefully the province. And sometimes leaders are not up to the task because their ministries see this as an encroachment on their territory. It happens. So, for example, we've been in a few regions where the ministers go along because who would say no to a peer assembly? You know, it doesn't sound right. But they're jealous of their prerogatives, which keeps us in these siloed pilot projects, all right, that don't connect. So what we found with this is that if you have strong local leadership, it keeps people together. And if you then continue with it enough time, it will cement itself so it becomes institutionalized as ad hoc peer assembly governance. When we do find, it's kind of funny, when they start to see these ministers that the local peer assemblies are really going to do this around the 7th or 8th month, they all start hurriedly typing in all of their ideas and examples because they know this is a change in the way we govern ourselves.
Interesting. Fascinating. I want to acknowledge, David, thank you for highlighting the question also about First Nations governance, which is so important in this conversation. Another question, Jeremy, that's coming in the chat, relates, coming from Simon in Australia, actually. Could you speak to the opportunity that COVID disruption provides? How can we use this situation, this disaster, strategically? And I know there's a lot of questions out there around what going forward is going to look like with bailouts and where money goes, and reflections or thoughts on that.
Well, we're having that conversation, deep conversation right now in Brussels. Let me say there's going to be more pandemics. This is something that this warning has come from the World Health Organization and from the UN and from all the world bodies, because what's happening here is the viruses are on the move. They are the new climate refugees. They're migrating. And the reason is this: a century ago, about 14% of the wild of this world had been domesticated and turned into human society, 14%. Today, only 23% of the world is still wild, not 80%. So what's happening is the animals are migrating and the viruses are migrating with them. And it's not just whether you eat bushmeat in a market. You have Ebola and SARS and MERS. There's just one after the other. So we are going to see viruses as we encroach more on the remaining wild part of this planet. Viruses are going to continue to hitch a ride on animals and to do this. We're also seeing that as the temperature heats up and we have more floods, droughts, wildfires, we're also seeing the viruses move with that. So we've got to be able to understand this is not a one-off and we're going to get back to normal. This is how we shift to the age of resilience, and how communities can begin to take responsibility for their 19 kilometers of biosphere and begin to build deep resilience into their infrastructure revolution, so they can not just survive, but prosper in a very different way than we have in the past. This is an ultimate transformation, and it's only going to be done at the regional level. We know this. Nation states will set the alignments, the codes, the standards, so everyone can cross border. But in Europe, it's our 325 regions. In the US, it'll be the 50 states because they own most of the infrastructure. In Canada, it's going to be the same thing. You'll need the federal government to set up the code, standards, regs. I'm hoping that one of your regions in Canada will be a test model to show the federal government it can happen, whether it's British Columbia or Ontario or Brunswick. Someone has to step forward like we've seen in Europe and show that it's possible to actually get the job done and to move forward in a totally different way.
I know, Kerry, you were particularly curious to hear Jeremy's reflections or thoughts, or to even comment on First Nations. So ask you to make your comment or pose a question.
I just wanted you to go in, for those that aren't, have more of an intimate understanding of this process, is in doing this infrastructure roadmap for a region is essentially getting people connected. And by starting and creating this hub here, which is required to have like more than 2 million and transportation logistics centers. But once we have created a hub that it can scale to rural remote communities to connect them so they can participate. The exciting part for me about this plan was that if we're able to connect rural remote communities, we're actually enabling them to participate in the economy where they previously haven't. And generally the people that face the greatest adversity are the best problem solvers, as we see in lots of disaster around the world. But when we first were pitching this plan to the region, when I went to Squamish Nation, it was so amazing to see how much they understood that this type of collaboration and community responsibility aligned with First Nation governance. And specifically what was responded well to was that when you say, here's our roadmap and here's all the projects, that the metrics that we're using to define prosperity, but also to choose projects, is done with this open transparency. And we're expanding our metrics for decision making to not towards our like GDP, but what are our social, environmental impacts and inequality. And if all the decisions we make are using those metrics, then it dramatically changes what the results are. And I just wanted you to, if you could speak to that.
Well, there's a lot of conversation about how disadvantaged communities need to be put in the front of the line, but they got to walk the walk. That means they have to be in the line and helping create the leadership that makes this thing forward. Too many times I've seen over the years where governments will come in, and it's really disgusting, really, and they'll have a focus group or a stakeholder group to win over allegiance of disadvantaged communities, all right? And they really then use that and go ahead and still don't look out for the interests of communities that are in jeopardy. With pandemics and climate change, the most disadvantaged communities have the worst public health. They don't have public health systems to rely on. They don't have the education. They don't even have broadband connection for their kids. And they need to be brought into the process in every region, as we've done in Europe, as part of the peer assembly leadership to make this happen. And I think the most interesting thing about this is when we eliminate the other. The moment people cross borders that they've never crossed, they realize human beings are human beings. And we each have something that we can share with the other so that we become the we. I don't mean that to be something fancy. This really works. So if we don't have that leadership, it's not going to happen. The other thing, Kerry, that's important, we don't believe cities can do this alone. We're very concerned about, as we also work, in the Asia, China, and other places, you have these big cities and they're walled off from the rural areas. What we're saying is you have to have an entire region engaged, a bioregion, because the bioregion has all of the biology of the planet that's necessary to sustain our lives. So we see every region has to extend from the metropolitan through the rural areas so that they all are equal at the table. For example, you take British Columbia. It's a tragedy there. You have so much potential wind and solar in British Columbia that would be available. There's no reason why First Nations aren't there assembling small and medium-sized enterprises and cooperatives and helping power not only British Columbia, but other parts of Canada. And I should say, I may step on some toes, but instead they put in a gas pipeline up there. They don't have the approval of the entire region and the First Nations, and that doesn't provide many jobs, and it also isn't empowering the community, and it isn't providing for sustainability. So the only way to get around that is everyone has to come to the table and create some leadership possibilities. And it's about protecting the entire biosphere, not just your urban area. Rural areas are absolutely essential to this, or you can't do one of these roadmaps.
And certainly this touches on, I think, a comment that Jenny Moore brought up, and this acknowledging that, rivers and migratory pathways don't know boundaries.
Yeah.
So I think.
Can I tell you something very cool? This is so cute. So when we first got involved with Rotterdam, we started to mention migratory patterns. My wife and I are very involved, especially my wife, in animal rights and animal activities and environment. And so we were sitting down with the government of the Rotterdam, and we mentioned migratory patterns. And they said, yes, we have a minister whose sole responsibility is migratory corridors to bring together all the members of our region, not just human beings. They actually have a minister. And that just almost brought tears to my eyes. It was great.
It's wonderful. Jeanette, there's a comment you'd like to add to this, and I want to make sure bring your voice into this. And folks, I'm trying to keep track of everything that's flowing in the chat. It's great. There's links and suggestions for further conversations. I love it. But Jeanette, go ahead. You're on mute.
I just wanted to take a moment to sort of shout out to our provincial government for the Clean BC program that's been put in place. I think, in terms of, if we look across Canada, there's some great leadership there already. So I think it creates a very strong foundation for this type of collaboration and infrastructure thinking that needs to come to life. So that's all I wanted to do. I think, and then, of course, talking about sort of the Cascadia region, and I know Jenny's gone that way, and it's nice to see so many great faces and thought leaders on this line as we have this conversation. But there are definitely opportunities to work with our friends south of the border because in some instances, for certain projects and initiatives, it just makes better sense. And on some instances, it makes sense to go further east and whatnot. So no, enjoying the conversation. I just wanted to do a shout out to Clean BC for sort of setting the stage for some of these discussions.
Could I just mention something on bioregions for a moment? We believe that, at least I believe that we're going to move more not just to globalization, because with the internet, communication and energy is going to be traveling across oceans under cable, and there's going to be mobility. We need to go beyond that and have bioregional governance. So I was just in the Midwest, I won't mention which state, with a governor, and the Great Lakes is a bioregion. You have the Cascadia region, which covers Canada and the US. You have the Great Lakes region, which covers two regions in Canada and 6 states in the US. You have the prairie regions that go from our Midwest up into Alberta. We see that more and more when we deal with pandemics, where you're crossing borders and you're dealing with climate disasters that are related, you have to deal with these in bioregional terms. You have to begin to see there are no borders. The borders are really, the biospheres and ecosystems are open. They're transparent, they're permeable. So I believe that for a younger generation that's here on this call, you'll begin to see a shift and with your leadership into bioregional governance. And then we'll really begin to see this is a borderless world. But that means each of us are responsible for some part of the world and the one we're living in. But we also are responsible to each other.
So maybe, Jeremy, just use that as a bit of a segue. I mean, you gave quite an extraordinary speech in France at SIPO. I think it was to a younger audience, expressing what you felt there, and I'm going to say our responsibility and accountability is in terms of what can or should we be doing.
I think the most heartening thing for me, and I didn't really realize this till last year, when I was in Italy and I met with some of the young people that were the Future Friday movement. And it dawned on me, and I insist, there's something really transformational happening in consciousness that marks a pivotal shift in human history. These protests, we had millions of young people who have gone out on strikes, millennials and Gen Zs, from their classrooms and their offices, et cetera. Millions of them have come out 3 times in 140 countries, and they protested. And I thought, okay, there's been protests all through history. What's new? I mean, it's good they're doing it, but we've had protests all through history. Then I realized when I was in Italy with the young people in the Future Friday, this isn't like any other protest. This is the first time in all of human history where an entire cohort of 2 generations, Gen Z and millennials, have come out across the world and they have seen themselves as an endangered species. That's never happened before. They have moved over and eliminated the other. And they began to see themselves as part of a larger evolutionary family, their fellow creatures. If they're endangered, we're endangered. And they began to see themselves as part of a biosphere in which all of life and the chemistry of the planet rests. I just got to emphasize that's never happened before in history. So I think what's shifting is the young people are moving from a geopolitical kind of boundary, traditional top-down world to a biosphere world. And this gets back to your original thought about the empathic impulse. We're moving it quickly in our neurology, if you will, in our neural circuitry to the planet. Now, we can't let that go. It's going to be up to a younger generation now to move into political power, to be on school boards and local city councils and run for office and be in local businesses and be engaged totally all the time in building a more resilient regional communities, or it won't happen.
That sounds like something that's going to take time. Do we have it?
This question is asked oftentimes. I'll give you an example. The US and Canada is very similar because, as you know, the UN has said we are running out of time. We're almost over to the 1.5 degrees Celsius shift, which takes us into a cascading series of environmental and climate disasters, which are going to be really difficult to contend with. In the United States, and you did this similar in Canada, we built out the whole first industrial revolution in about 30 years. 1865 to 1895, we laid out a continental railroad system. You guys did the same thing for transportation. We set up a continental telegraph system for communications. We established the Homesteading Act in the US and ceded 15% of the public land for people to create the new homes and habitats. We set up the land-grant universities to train a generation in shifting into industrial age. And you did something similar in Canada, 30 years. The second industrial revolution is about the same in Canada and the US. Beginning in 1908, for 25 years in the urban areas, not yet the rural, we introduced electricity across all the urban areas. We put in telephone systems in all the urban areas. We put out millions of vehicles in all the urban areas. We laid out road systems, pipelines, fuel stations. We did that in the urban areas. The rural areas took longer, but we did that in 25 years. We believe, based on our experience in Europe and now in China, that a US and Canada can move even quicker with that entrepreneurial, social entrepreneurial spirit. I think if it all aligns and regions take responsibility, we can get toward a near zero emission economy with this infrastructure and the new businesses and employment in one generation, 20 years. Not all of it, but almost 100%. But this would require a completely different mindset.
So I'm aware that I'm not catching all of the questions that are coming. I would encourage you, if you do want to bring your voice in this, to raise your hand. I'm going to read Cecilia's, and we've just got about 5 minutes left. Cecilia's question in the Chipang 6, the question is, how does the backlash against globalization and potentially increasing trends towards protectionism amidst and in the aftermath of COVID-19 impact lateralization or the concepts of bioregionalism perspective?
Well, I think we're heading from globalization to glocalization. And we're learning from the pandemic, and we're also learning from climate disasters that when you build for lean supply lines and logistics, et cetera, and when you don't have a certain amount of sustainability at the regional level, you can be in trouble when those supply chains and logistics, fall apart. I think Gandhi got it right. He said, look, you have to be sustainable in your local region. But then there are things you'll need from other regions. So you build concentric circles out. And what you can't be sustainable about, you join in deep relationship with circles upon circles upon circles to engage the globe. Globalization will make that happen because the communication internet is now global. The young people are gaming and with each other, millions of them, and sports events, gaming sports events virtually. They're in Skyping, they're on Facebook, they're engaged in all sorts of things. We know that the electricity internet's now going to go under oceans. It's going to go around the world, and people will share their solar and wind. You can't share fossil fuels. It creates a geopolitics, and it creates a lot of war, and a lot of people have died for fossil fuels. But with solar and wind, if one region of the world, needs it, and another region has it, you have these digitized electricity internets, which are emerging now across Europe. That can begin to allow you to share your energy with others. It creates a completely different way to deal with energy. So you're sharing. It's power to the people, literally and figuratively. And it forces sharing, but in the sharing, we began to see how we're responsible for each other. We live under one sun. The wind flows around the world. So there are these positive side effects that we don't realize until we get engaged in it. So I'm hopeful. I'm not naive. This is a tough climb, but it's going to depend on whether the human race can roll up our sleeves in places like British Columbia and be first movers. We need some first movers.
So on that note, Kerry, you alluded to some effort that had been made to make some movement here in BC. Do you care to just comment very briefly on that? I'm aware we just have a couple minutes remaining.
Yeah, it's been a long haul. If I'd known that it would be 2 years later, I'd still be doing this. I don't know if I would have ever started. This made sense to me, and we were ready to go, basically. We had mobilized all the key stakeholders, and unfortunately, as we were ready to sign the deal, we even had contracts ready to go to start this process. There was the municipal elections, and all of the stakeholders were suddenly moving and had different agendas and priorities. So that was very frustrating, and then really kickstarted it again when the UN the ICPP report came out, and it was just like, this has to happen, whether we call it Green New Deal or whatever, call it what you will, that we actually need to make this transition. So just trying to regather stakeholders and gather enough support to make it to happen. The reason that we're here together is because Innovation Capital partnered with Foresight to make an application to respond to the Low Carbon Cities Canada fund, and to do this work here to realize what the requirements of that are.
Thanks, Kerry. Jeanette, as our ultimate convener at Foresight, any closing comments you'd like to make before we?
No, I think, at Foresight, our philosophy is to learn about as many different ways and paths forward that are possible to help us transition to a green economy. I think it's just been such a pleasure to have you, Jeremy, sharing sort of your perspective and thought leadership on what's possible and how people can mobilize, whether it's from a governance perspective or a mandate perspective. There's definitely lots of opportunities and takeaways here. Foresight is currently working on a cluster strategy for the province, and there's lots of opportunity for projects, but everything that we do moving ahead, it has to be collaborative. There's so many important stakeholders that need to come together, and so finding mechanisms and means to get people on board to collaborate is important. So it's been great to learn and listen and hear feedback and questions from all the different folks on here, and we're going to continue having these types of dialogues as often as possible, so that we can all just learn and challenge each other, and I'm glad that that's what's happened today. So thank you, and thank you, Charles, for moderating, and of course Kerry. It's been so exciting to get to know Kerry more and more over the last 6 months, or maybe 3-4 months. So thank you. So I don't know, Charles, if you have a bit of a plan, you want to do a breakout. I've
been getting lots of private messages saying you didn't give us long enough in the breakouts. I'd like the opportunity for some synergy again. So we're going to do that, recognizing people are going to drop off at the top of the hour, which it is now, but we're going to keep the Zoom open and give people just the option to go to a Zoom room if you want to reflect on what you've heard. So that's going to happen in just a minute. Jeremy, thank you so much. As a Canadian, your message so aligns with what I feel are our values as Canadians, and our ability to place community above ideology, I hope, is something that we will all hold to in our efforts to create the kind of collaboration, Jeanette, that you speak to, collaboration at levels we long for and haven't yet fully experienced. So
thanks for giving me the opportunity. It was a pleasure.
And so, Charles, if you want to stop recording and then everyone can break out, that would be great. Thank you all, and we'll update you more for what's happening next week shortly. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Kerry.